these are just some of the qualities of Debbie Tucker Green's playwriting. So you'll see that across, you'll see these qualities across several of her plays, and I think some of these qualities also speak to the issue of universalising tendencies that are read from her plays. So while these kind of bare stages, limited decor, she often uses just chairs as her main setting. So Ear for Eye, for example, the first part had several chairs, and the second part had just one chair. The first part was filmed, so it was irrelevant. Born Bad, one of her other plays that was on at another venue, it was about a family in their front room, talking about the impact of historic sexual abuse on one of the women in the family, but the setting wasn't the typical kind of Caribbean front room, even though she'd said this is a blood-related black family. It was simply a bare stage with a pile of chairs, and each of the characters would enter the stage, take a chair, slam it down, enter the circle. The chairs kind of become a kind of prop and something that is used in the power dynamics and the discussion that's happening. That's why I talk about chairography. That's my kind of second point. That's something I teach a second year course on Debbie Tucker Green, and one of the things we've looked at quite a lot is this thing around chairography. What do we do with the chairs? If they're our only prop, if they're our only scenic item, how can we make them kind of meaningful to what we're doing with her work, and with how we set up the kind of dynamics, the stage dynamics and the stage picture simply with chairs. Her plays tend to focus on language, very wordy. They're not often that easy to read, actually. What I've found from working with students and her plays is that sometimes the students will come to class and be like, oh my God, I literally didn't understand this play. It's really hard to read this play because it's got overlapping, because it's got repetition, because you can't always keep an eye on who's speaking when. But once we start to work with the plays in the room, and different people are occupying different voices, then we start, those qualities of the work start to come through. So she tries to recreate a language and style that reflects how we really speak. This is one of the things that she said very early on in one of her interviews. She's like, listen to young people. They just repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. You know, young people speak really fast, and you know, you might, sometimes I'm on the bus and I hear people going like, yeah, bruv, yeah, and do you know what I mean, bruv, and yeah, and I have no idea what they're saying, but you know what you're saying. And I remember when I was young, that's how I used to talk as well, right? It's like, yeah, believe in it. No, do you know what? Is it? Nah, man. And we all know what we're saying, or you all know what we're saying now. I used to know what I was saying when I spoke like that, right? And she tries to kind of recreate some of that rhythm, if you like, and some of that, the ways in which young people speak to each other. Again, that points to the kind of dramatic, poetic use of repetition, which kind of comes out of that. And then a really important quality of her work is active silences. So you'll see in the text of Ear for Eye, you'll see some of the character names, where the character's name is written, but there are no words attached to it. But something happens in that moment. She's written it for something to happen between that character and the other characters in that moment. So you might talk about what do we do to fill the active silence? Do we fill it with a gesture, with a look, with a shrug, with some sort of action? So the idea that there's something active going on, even though there are no words being spoken. And then, so if you open a Debbie Tucker Green play, it's really important to look at the beginning of the play where she gives the instructions for that particular play text. And one of the things that she uses quite a lot is she says, the words that are in brackets are intentions. So when you're talking the text, you're not to speak those words aloud, but they're intentions, they're thoughts that kind of guide you towards the ways in which you kind of speak those words. So all of these qualities have been described by director Sacha Ware as being like musical notation. So Sacha Ware has worked on several Debbie Tucker Green plays, and she describes the punctuation as a kind of code. quote, a bit like musical notation, instructions on the page that tell the performer when to pause, when to slow down, when to speed up, what to give an accent on, and so on. The performer's job is to follow the writer's instructions and to discover for themselves the emotional or psychological reasons behind the rhythm changes. I find this a really useful way of thinking about Debbie Tucker Green and thinking about the ways in which we can play with her work, the ways in which her writing is there to kind of guide us in terms of what we do and how we interpret it, but also the ways in which we can kind of play with that and play with different ways of interpreting the play, different ways of decoding it. So I'm going to move on now to some context that we think inform Tucker Green's plays, but particularly kind of context for this play. So there have been well-known incidents of police brutality, both historically and in the present in the USA. So if we go back a few years to the 90s, there was the release of video footage of police officers beating Rodney King in Los Angeles in 1991, and this led to riots in 1992 when the officers involved were acquitted. These kinds of incidents inform and form part of the historical footprint of black cultural experience. And I argue that they shape and affect our perceptions of and trust in the police. Of course, in the UK, there's our own troubled history with the police. Relations between young black people and the police have remained fraught. There's a lot of tensions, a lot of mistrust, and these tensions are compounded by kind of institutional racism and the idea of discriminatory policing practices. So there's a disproportionate number of young black men apprehended for stop and search, for example. The use of excessive force in arrest of young black men. Of course, further questions can be raised in relation to the number of black deaths during or soon after being in custody with the police. And this goes back quite a long time and come up with names of people who've been dying after being in custody with the police. And of course, the police's investigation of race hate attacks and racist murders have also been subjected to scrutiny. And I know you'll all be familiar with that image, that could be an image that you kind of grew up with, which is Stephen Lawrence, which is probably the most prominent blundered police investigation into a racist murder in British history, or recent British history certainly. Stephen Lawrence was murdered by a group of 5 white men, youth, in April 1993. Their names were given to the police soon after the murder, and the investigation had so many blunders that those men were free for 19 years. 2 of them were convicted of a crime in 2012. So they were free for 19 years, and they killed Stephen Lawrence. He was 18 years old. So they were free for longer than his short life. A tribunal into the case concluded that the police actions were marred by institutional racism, and that's a quote from the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry report. Institutional racism consists of the collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture or ethnic origin. It can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwanted prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racial stereotyping which disadvantage minority ethnic people. So in the Stephen Lawrence case, some of these unwitting race prejudices involve not tending to his wounds properly and not checking where the blood was coming from when he was lying, bleeding to death on the streets. The flaws that I've already mentioned in kind of pursuing the assailants, which allowed those men to go free. These issues, as I've said, kind of inform the ways in which the relations between black people and the police function in the UK, and quite a few playwrights have looked at at these concerns. Notably, Roy Williams. That's kind of a history of several plays that have looked at the different ways in which black people and police and institutional racism manifest. I just point your attention to the Richard Norton Taylor. Probably got a red button, right? Richard Norton Taylor, which is a case about the Stephen Lawrence Tribunal. So if you're kind of interested in that, that would be worth following up. But notably, Roy Williams has written 3 plays about the police. There are a couple of plays there that are about the more recent case of Mark Duggan, who was shot during an arrest by police in 2011, and the protest of which then kind of led to, or ended in, riots. So there's a couple of plays there that kind of relate to that. I wanted to put those as a context because I think that where most of those plays deal with the question of institutional racism, police procedure, and police practices, I think Debbie Tucker-Green's play becomes interesting because she looks at the potential impact on black families. So she looks at the ways in which black people can protect ourselves when dealing with the police. So there are several scenes that show characters, sons, interacting with their parents, both in the UK and both in the US and in the UK, interacting with their parents and discussing a kind of sense of, what do I do with my hands when I'm confronted by the police? If my hands are in my pocket, no, that might be belligerent. If I put them behind my back, no, that's whatever. So every action that the son describes is deemed to be open to potential misinterpretation. So he's thought to be threatening, provocative, inflammatory, a sign of aggression or a sign of belligerence. I think at the Royal Court production, one of the really interesting and I guess powerful moments in the scene was when we saw the UK version of that scene, and it was played by an actor who was deaf and with kind of associated kind of speech issues, and the scene was performed in sign language. So he was signing with his parents about, what do I do in these cases? And this became really powerful to me because I was thinking, well, gesture is the only language that this young man has. That is his language. And if his only language could be subject to misinterpretation and therefore life-threatening, then there's a real problem there. So I thought that the casting choice, Debbie Tucker-Green's casting choice of a deaf actor in that scene really drove home the point in a really significant way.
So the play itself, as those of you who've read it will know, it's split into 3 distinct parts. Part 1, Part 2 and Part 3. Lynette's just talked about some of the scenes that are in Part 1. It's a sort of multitude of scenes with a couple of recurring characters in each one, but generally they're all fairly independent to one another. So we have the US and the UK families. We also have recounts of sort of inappropriate behaviour by the police in custody from UK prisoners. We also have recounts of an older protester from older civil rights movements, and then we have recounts of a young protester from civil rights movements. I think we have protesters in the UK and the US once again, and then there is a conversation between an older and a younger academic talking about the validity of protest and demonstration and how they should do that. Yeah, so I'm sure you'll all be aware that protest has been pretty big over the last decade, really. If you want to put any bets on, I reckon that the 2010s will be remembered as a decade of protest, essentially. Even back in 2011, Time magazine was calling The Protester its Person of the Year. And there's a question around protest that is sort of raised in A4I in discussion, particularly between the older black academic and the younger academic, which is what is the point of protest? Should we still be protesting? Does it change anything? Although you heard me earlier talk about dehumanisation, and protest is often figured as a way to rehumanise people. You get out on the streets, you're shouting to power, you're saying that I'm here, recognise me, recognise my needs. But the problem with protest is, of course, the question, what does it change? Does it change anything? The Hong Kong protests have been going on and we're not really seeing too much change there. The protests around Brexit, for leaving and remaining, they've just continued on and on and on, and still doesn't seem to be any change there. And in A4I, one of the sort of taglines for the production at the Royal Court was "Marching Days is over," and it's sort of this declamation that perhaps sort of peaceful protest is not going to get us anywhere, because with the civil rights movement and with Black Lives Matter, it's people getting out on the street and showing their solidarity. But if you're not seeing the change at a systemic level in your society or in your politics, then you have to wonder, what is the point of this? And there's a sort of threat in A4I. Even the last line of the play is sort of showing this, that patience is running thin, and maybe the time for peaceful protest is drawing to an end. An actual revolution, which may indeed cause violence, might be the only solution.